Hello, my name is Katie Taylor. I am an assistant professor at Eastern Washington University with my PhD in exercise physiology, and one of my main research interests is understanding the role of physical activity in people with inflammatory bowel disease, both from an inflammation perspective and particularly health-related quality of life. So I am here today. I've been invited by Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America and the Northwest chapter to share some of my research and my interests with you, so that you can start to understand the beneficial role that physical activity may play for your life with inflammatory bowel disease. So I do want to give a quick rundown of how today will work. So I'm going to present to you for about 30 to 45 minutes. I'm going to try and keep it on the shorter side. We'll run through kind of where the physical activity world and the role that plays in health and disease is right now, and then we'll tie that into inflammatory bowel disease, and then I'm going to try and give you a couple of tangible points as little take-home messages towards the end. And then I will be open for questions on Sunday, the 13th, so this coming Sunday between 10 a.m. and 12 noon. My particular slot will be at 11 a.m. till 12 noon, so I hope you'll join us then, so I can answer any questions you may have. If you're unavailable or perhaps don't get a chance to ask your question on Sunday, then I have also included my contact information at the end of my presentation, so feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So as we have learned this whole Zoom world, I'm just going to quickly share my screen and then get us going. So like I said, I'm currently out of Eastern Washington University, and I am still really interested, despite my move from completing my PhD at the University of Idaho, in the role of physical activity as a therapeutic strategy in people with inflammatory bowel disease. So starting us off, why physical activity? So when I began this world of research, there was really not a big recommendation for people with inflammatory bowel disease to be physically active, and that's because of what we have seen in some of these long endurance type events, such as your marathon or your Ironman triathletes, where they are known to experience severe gastrointestinal distress due to the activity. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, they're hitting the ground a lot over the course of maybe 26.2 miles. And we know that every force has an equal and opposite reaction, or every action has an equal opposite reaction. And so that ground is hitting back, and that as we hit the ground, we're getting those micro traumas in the GI tract as one of the first organs that are lower to the ground to receive kind of those vibrations. And then we also, as we exercise, particularly in these long events, we take in fluids and foods, particularly gels and jelly beans and those sorts of things that are typically high in levels of fructose because we need them for energy, except our body prefers energy in the form of glucose. And so it has to convert this fructose to glucose, which is a little bit of a hassle on a good day, but as we're exercising, we're actually shunting blood away from our gastrointestinal tract to the skeletal muscle, because that's seen as a priority to get oxygen and nutrients to the muscle. So we take it away from places where they don't need it as much during exercise, which is one of those is the GI tract. So we are asking our bodies to digest this fructose without perhaps the blood and the oxygen and the nutrients to be able to do that effectively, which results in what we have commonly termed runner's trots, or essentially severe gastrointestinal distress such as diarrhea and vomiting. So when you look at a person with inflammatory bowel disease, you may not want them to be exercising, considering they have to go through many of these symptoms on a day-to-day basis, and we don't want to worsen that. So it came to a point where we did not prescribe physical activity or exercise to people with inflammatory bowel diseases. And although we have the anecdotal evidence from these long endurance type activities, that's not necessarily what we're prescribing. A 20-minute walk is unlikely to cause the same level of gastrointestinal distress as a 26.2 marathon or many hours of activity. And so the research doesn't necessarily agree with this statement. And this is where kind of my years of work are coming in to try and overcome this. We also have some anecdotal evidence that says that we can be physically active with inflammatory bowel disease without exacerbating our disease. So we have our famous NFL players who have played in their prime with inflammatory bowel disease. We have a Team Great Britain, one of the most decorated Olympians in Team Great Britain, a rower, Sir Steve Redgrave, who has ulcerative colitis, and then ice hockey players. And these are just 4 of many athletes with some type of inflammatory bowel disease. So Steve Redgrave's wife was the chief medical officer for Team GB at the time. And he, after some conversations with him, I really liked this statement that he gave me, that it can't be ulcerative colitis because you couldn't train with that disease. And this was the message he was given by his physician at the time. And it was only after the removal of 17 pieces of his intestine for diagnosis purposes that they actually came to the diagnosis of ulcerative colitis, because they truly believed that you couldn't exercise with it. And so we're starting to overcome some of these fallacies and barriers in our knowledge base. Robert Butler of the National Institute of Aging once said, and I have slightly adapted this, if the benefits of exercise, which I have adapted to physical activity, could be packed into a pill, it would be the single most widely prescribed and beneficial drug in the nation. And it's true. We know from our research in cardiovascular disease that physical activity is beneficial in the prevention and management of the disease. It's beneficial in people with cancer. It's related to reduced onset of breast and colon cancers. It helps with the management of the disease and the symptoms associated with treatment in cancer survivors. It's also beneficial in diabetes, and these are just to name a few of the many diseases that physical activity has a beneficial role in. These are some of the more researched ones, and so when we look at inflammatory bowel disease, we're not quite at the level yet that these diseases have been researched. So it started back in the 1950s when Jeremy Morris looked at a group of individuals and autopsy reports, and particularly looking at London bus drivers versus London bus conductors. So your bus driver sits for about 8 hours a day, just driving the bus around the streets of London. Your conductor is hopping on and off the bus, running up and down the stairs as he is collecting people's tickets. So your bus driver has largely got an inactive occupation, whereas your bus conductor is much more active. And so Jeremy Morris looked at this data in terms of light, active, and heavy, in terms of physical activity levels. So your light is going to be your bus drivers. They're really not doing a whole lot of activities, maybe a little bit of upper body work. But in comparison to your bus conductors who have much heavier activity levels. And then he looked at the levels of coronary deaths and non-coronary deaths. And he found that those individuals who were more active had lower death rates for coronary and non-coronary deaths. And then he broke this down into infarct and fibrosis. So infarct is our heart attacks, just to give you an idea there. And so again, finding the same trend with a downward trend, that there were less deaths as our occupations were more active. And so this was one of the most pivotal studies in the realm of physical activity and understanding the beneficial role. And it took us until 1992 to recognize it as a cardiovascular disease modifiable lifestyle risk factor by the CDC. But since then, we have been able to gather so much evidence that physical activity really is beneficial to human health. It was further supported by the Harvard alumni study, which we have particularly on the left-hand side of graph here, and I can just get my laser pointer ready for you guys. So in this graph here, this is the Harvard alumni study, which was in all males. And then this one adds in the nurses' health study as well. And so on the left here, we're looking at physical activity levels. And then on the right, we're looking at physical fitness. So in terms of physical activity levels, As we start getting past that 1,000 calories a week mark in terms of energy expenditure, then we are starting to accrue benefits and reducing our risk of all-cause mortality. And by engaging in about 1,000 kcals a week of physical activity, which is the National Physical Activity Guideline recommendation now, we have about a 30% decrease in all-cause mortality risk. When we look at physical fitness levels, essentially getting out of the lowest quintile of physical fitness, the lowest being Q1 and the highest being Q5, we start to accrue benefits and have a reduced risk of all-cause mortality. And we know that the more physical activity that we do, the higher our cardiovascular fitness level starts to become. And this, on this side here with physical fitness, we know that our benefits are fairly similar between males and females also. So other benefits of physical activity. We've talked about kind of reduce the risk of all-cause mortality, and we've talked a little bit about reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease. We also know that we can reduce the prevalence, and we can help treat type 2 diabetes with physical activity, but we see about a 30% reduction also in colon cancer. And these two, type 2 diabetes and colon cancer, I think are also important for people with inflammatory bowel disease, because we do see higher rates of type 2 diabetes when people are prescribed steroids due to the side effect of the steroids. But we also know that colon cancer is related to inflammatory bowel disease as well. And then on the mental health side of things, we see that depression is decreased by up to 30% when we engage in at least 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week, which is, again, the US National Physical Activity recommendations. So we see both physical and mental benefits associated with physical activity, which is why I thought that this could really play a role in people with inflammatory bowel disease. So what is physical activity? I've been throwing this term around, and I made a pretty distinct change in the quote by Robert Butler from exercise to physical activity. So physical activity is any activity that requires skeletal muscle contraction and results in an increase in expenditure. So it means that we have to use our muscles, and it causes us to either breathe harder or our heart rate go up, essentially. So any activity that involves those are considered physical activity. So maybe walking your dog, it may be going walk around the neighborhood, it may be running, it may be biking, anything like that, or going to the gym and lifting some weights. Exercise is a little bit different because it is it does encompass physical activity, but it also means that they have to be goal orientated. So you are doing it to improve your cardiorespiratory fitness, or you're doing it to improve your body composition. A lot of times when we use the term exercise, it has negative connotations with it. People have, whether it's from school or kind of social side of things, when they think, oh, you know, exercise is going to the gym and getting all sweaty, and I don't like that, or it means I have to work really hard and make myself feel ill or be in a lot of pain. And so I think physical activity, I prefer the term, is a little bit easier for us to understand and be okay with doing. But physical activity sits on a continuum. And so when we look at it, we're looking at the lowest level, which is light intensity activity. And then, so this can be things like walking your dog. It can be walking to the park with your child. It can be doing some gardening or playing a round of golf. We have moderate intensity, where we have required our bodies to have to work a little bit harder. So it might be we're breathing a little bit harder, or our heart rate is increased, or both. And so this can be things like some moderate weightlifting, dancing, swimming, those sorts of ideas. And then we get into this idea of vigorous intensity, when it's got harder again. And so things like singles tennis, running, hiking, and can all be types of vigorous activity. You'll note that I have color coordinated some of these, and this isn't just so it looks pretty. It is that the red ones we can change these, and they might fall into moderate intensity or they might fall in vigorous intensities. For examples, I very specifically said singles tennis when I talked about vigorous intensity activities. If you were to play doubles tennis, it requires a little less of you, so it becomes a moderate intensity activity. Let's take hiking, for example. If you are hiking up a really steep mountain on a trail that's not paved, then that's going to be a vigorous intensity activity. Whereas if you're on a paved trail that's nice and smooth and it's a gradual incline, then it might be more of a moderate intensity activity. So any of these can shift up or down. And so a way to determine whether you're engaging in a moderate intensity activity or a vigorous intensity activity is by using what we call the talk test. And so when we are talking about light intensity activities, you can both hold a conversation, sing a song with ease as you're out on your walk. You might be jamming along to the music in your earbuds. But as you get into that moderate intensity activity, you're going to still be able to hold that conversation, but you might not very easily be able to sing along to a song now. And then as we get into that vigorous intensity activity, you're not going to be able to string multiple sentences together to hold that conversation. You'll be able to talk here and there, but you're going to be breathing a lot harder and focusing on the activity that you're doing. It becomes harder to engage in a full conversation. And of course, you definitely can't sing a song. So it's a nice little way without having to rely on technology to determine what type of activity you're doing. And then there's this other idea of sedentary behavior. So this is anything that you're doing whilst you're awake, so sleep does not count into this. That is of a low level of energy expenditure whilst you're sitting or in some sort of reclining posture. So as I sit here and present to you, I am engaging in sedentary behavior levels. And we do know that in terms of our physiology, sedentary behavior can have negative health consequences aside of not participating in physical activity. So it's really important to start to consider this, particularly if you engage in high levels of sedentary behavior, as you might do if you work at a computer all day, 8 hours a day, and those sorts of things. So in terms of our continuum, we have still our light, our moderate, and vigorous intensity activities. But at the lower end, we have sedentary behavior, where it's some type of sitting or reclining activity. So you might be lying on the sofa watching an episode on a streaming service, or you might be sat at your desk doing some work. Those still are both sedentary behaviors that do have certain negative health consequences with them. So, although we have this idea of physical activity and we have physical activity guidelines, how does it really work to help these things like cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes? And we keep saying that there are health benefits to it, and we can break those down to two categories. We have our physical health benefits, we have our mental health benefits. So in terms of physical health, we see improvements in muscular strength and cardiorespiratory fitness, or kind of our heart and lung capacity to do exercise and to do activities as we engage in physical activity. We see improvements in some of our metabolic systems, so how we produce and use insulin. We see improvements in our arteries. They become better and less likely for atherosclerosis, which is definitely a precursor to things like heart attacks and those sorts of things. We see decreases in body fat percentage and something called visceral fat. So this is the fat that oftentimes surrounds your organs, which may be protective in small amounts, but as we accumulate larger amounts, we actually have high levels of inflammation with this fat. So high levels of visceral fat are associated with a lot of inflammatory diseases, such as diabetes and metabolic syndrome. In terms of mental health, we see benefits of cognitive function. We see improved cognitive function as we engage in high levels of physical activity, and we see improved resilience, which is important as we get to some of my future research that's shown in these slides. We see improvements or higher levels of release of our happy hormones or endorphins, and we see less of a stress response. So we're actually better able to cope with stress when we're physically active. So this all relates some way to inflammatory bowel disease, but particularly when we look at these things. So in terms of mental health, physical activity is related to improved quality of life. And we know that people with inflammatory bowel disease can generally have lower levels of quality of life. Also, because of that decrease in visceral fat, we also see that physical activity has high release of anti-inflammatory markers, and that partnered with less visceral fat also reduces inflammation in the body. And when we think about inflammatory bowel disease, it is a disease associated with inflammation. So we do know, or do think, I should say, that there will be some benefit there. So this is where I usually start my presentation if I'm presenting somewhere like the American College of Sports Medicine, because they oftentimes don't know as much about inflammatory bowel disease. But as this is a different audience, I've changed it up a little bit, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about telling you what your disease is, because you likely know it better than any of us. But I do want to highlight a couple of things, and it is chronic inflammation, and that's really important to remember when we think about the mechanisms that may be playing a role in terms of physical activity. So I do want to break it down, though, into Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, because I think this is really interesting when we look at how the research has been done, even though we have fairly limited amounts of research, because it poses a unique problem. When we work with, let's say, diabetes, where a lot of the time you'll see the research is out on type 2 diabetes, and that is because it's mechanistically quite different to type 1 diabetes. And the same goes here. Crohn's disease is mechanistically quite different to ulcerative colitis. Crohn's disease, as you likely know, particularly those of you who do suffer with Crohn's disease, has transmural inflammation, or inflammation all the way through the intestinal wall. It has increased levels of visceral fat out on the outside of the gastrointestinal tract, and it affects anywhere from gum to bum. Okay, so it affects the whole of the GI tract. Whereas ulcerative colitis is limited to the large intestine or the colon, and it also does not have that transmural inflammation. Instead, it has those ulcerated surfaces on the inner layer. So that's where we really see that inflammation is on that inner layer of the GI tract, or of the large intestine, I should say. So, a little academic selfie here, I've got to put myself first. But part of my PhD was to look at physical activity, sitting, and quality of life in people with inflammatory bowel diseases compared to what we term controls, or people without the disease. So the first aspect of what we did was I sent a survey out far and wide on the internet and recruited 242 people with inflammatory bowel disease and 265 what we term healthy controls. And this meant that they had no cardiovascular, pulmonary, metabolic, or renal disease, but they also didn't have inflammatory bowel disease as well. And we broke down the people with inflammatory bowel disease into two groups, those that stated or self-reported that they were in remission, and those that self-reported they were in a disease flare. And then we compared the quality of life scores across the three groups. And we did that for physical quality of life and mental quality of life. And we found that in both sets of quality of life, that our healthy controls had the highest levels of quality of life, higher both than IBD in remission, which is in white, and IBD disease flare, which is in gray. And we also found that those that were in a flare reported a lower quality of life, which for you guys probably goes without saying. But it was really good to understand this, and we did look at the subscales of the survey that we used to do this as well, and found that it really wasn't driven just by one aspect of quality of life, but really a holistic point of view. But from there, obviously that wouldn't just make the study in itself, because it is something we have generally known, but it was good to kind of reaffirm that. We then looked at physical activity across these three groups. So we looked at different aspects. So we had our sitting, which was right on the cusp of kind of the breakthrough in the research that we now have in terms of sedentary behavior. Sedentary behavior is a fairly new topic. I was just a little bit ahead and didn't kind of grasp onto it. So there's some downsides with this data. We actually found no differences, but this data only represents the amount of time spent sitting on a typical weekday. And there are two issues with that. A weekday is not the same as a weekend day. We generally do participate in different activities on different days. And then also, it was only looking at sitting, which is only one type of sedentary behavior. And so does not have the same effect. So we saw no differences across these three groups, although we saw a slight trend for a little bit higher level of sitting. And these are in minutes per day, whereas walking's minutes per week. But we did see in our physical activity, so we looked at walking, which is here on the left. We looked at moderate physical activity and vigorous physical activity, so if you remember from your continuum that I presented earlier. And then we combined the two to get moderate to vigorous physical activity, because this is what our physical activity guidelines are based on. And across all levels of physical activity, we found that our healthy controls had significantly higher levels of physical activity. This kind of was not necessarily unexpected. We did expect that people with IBD would have lower levels of physical activity. But what was really interesting for me is that we actually found no significant differences between those that were in remission and those that are in disease flare, suggesting that perhaps, although being in a disease flare, they're still engaging in some level of physical activity whilst in that flare. If we roll back now in our timeline a little bit, one of the first studies done on physical activity and inflammatory bowel disease was by Luden just before the 2000s. And they did a 12-week exercise program where they had participants who had Crohn's disease walk 3 times a week. And what they wanted to understand was the role of this exercise on the quality of life of the people with Crohn's disease, their disease state, and their fitness level. And so the results are displayed here. And what's really interesting is how we see the changes across each of those 3 domains. So our Harvey-Bradshaw index relates to disease stress in people with Crohn's disease. And so we see a significant decrease in their disease stress or disease state, which is a beneficial response to activity. And this is one of the first studies that really showed against the idea that I presented in that very first slide, that we have that people with IBD shouldn't do exercise. Then they looked at quality of life, and they saw there was a significant increase in quality of life as measured by the IBDQ, which is a specific IBD-focused quality of life scale. And they also showed a significant increase, about a 10% increase in physical fitness, which is really interesting because these participants are only engaging in walking. And usually when we see increases in physical fitness, it's because we're engaging in pretty high intensity activities. And so this would be a low intensity activity, and yet we still see benefits. Following on from Luden's research, we had a almost like replication of this study, again in Crohn's disease patients, although they did quantify their exercise program a little bit more, in that they did walking for 30 minutes on 3 days a week for, again, 12 weeks. Which meets the kind of basic minimum that we expect of people to avoid cardiovascular disease risk. And they broke into 2 groups, their Crohn's disease participants, to an exercise group and then a non-exercise group. And this study solely looked at quality of life, but they did so in a really holistic manner, which is why I decided to include in this presentation. So this is the sum score of all aspects of quality of life. And we can see here that kind of looking at the gray circles, which are really hard to distinguish. So I've kind of highlighted them for you here. So this top group, this is our exercise group. And what we found is that across the 4 time points that quality of life was measured, we see a significant increase in their quality of life score. It was almost immediate as well. So that first time point was pre the exercise program, and then the second one was during the exercise program, and they'd already increased that quality of life score and then maintained that across. And then the authors broke down their research into their different subscales. So we have an emotional and social subscale here, which show kind of the mental and social well-being side of quality of life. And so there's a slight curvilinear response, so it kind of goes up and then kind of falls off just a little bit, although generally we see increased emotional quality of life in those that are exercising versus not exercising. And then the same with the social side of things as well. Then when we look at the physical side, we look at both the systemic, so kind of whole body, and then the bowel subscale. And again, we're seeing very similar responses. It has that initial increase and then plateaus across, whereas across all 4 subscales and the overall scale, we see no changes in our non-exercise group, which is underneath the red box. And then more recently, Van Erp's team has kind of taken this research and looked at it from the perspective of fatigue and quality of life. We know that fatigue is a very common side effect of inflammatory bowel disease. And what's really interesting here is they took people with IBD. So we're not just looking at one of the disease states here. And they again did a 12-week exercise program. What they did here is they did aerobic exercise training, partnered, and this is the first study to my knowledge that has done this, partnering it with a resistance exercise training portion as well, which is really interesting, and how we move forward in terms of physical activity guidelines for people with IBD. So they studied bowel changes where they saw no differences, and then they also studied the effects of exercise on quality of life and fatigue. And I am going to premise here that there is an error in this graph, that I have my colors flipped, which is super confusing. So I apologize profusely for that. Gray is actually our quality of life. Our quality of life should increase, and then red is fatigue. So that is my inability to correctly name my graphs, and I take full responsibility for that error there. So we do see a significant increase in health-related quality of life, and we see a significant decrease in fatigue in those individuals as they participated in this 12-week aerobic and resistance training exercise program. We've seen a number of other studies, which I highlight here. So a 10-week exercise program of moderate intensity running. So again, now we're looking at this idea that we can have individuals run, although maybe not 26.2 miles straight off the bat, they can engage in running, and it does not exacerbate the disease, but also we see an almost 20% increase in quality of life in those individuals who engage in the exercise program with inflammatory bowel disease. We also see some research, and this is my undergraduate mentor, Dr. Lindsay Bottoms, who herself has inflammatory bowel disease. And she looked at the idea of comparing high intensity interval training, which is the other arm of my research field and research interests, and moderate intensity continuous training in people with Crohn's disease. And typically when we have studied high intensity interval training in young adults, healthy generally, young adults, as well as overweight and obese individuals, we have found consistently this elicits a negative emotional response. We don't feel good doing it. Like, we don't feel like we're feeling great. Like, our emotion isn't like, this is awesome, this is particularly during the exercise. But we do tend to find that it's a pretty enjoyable exercise. We just don't have that great positive emotional response during it. What was really interesting about Dr. Bottoms' study is that enjoyment was really high in these individuals as they participated across that 12-week program. And then their effective response, or what we term an emotional response, was actually really positive. And then they didn't elicit that, what we typically seem to be a negative emotional response. So you can even do some exercises like high intensity interval training, which is those quick bursts of activity. So kind of like the Coach to 5K program, where they ask you to run for a minute and walk for a minute, jog for a minute, walk for a minute. That's our high intensity interval training, where moderate intensity continuous training is exercising for that 20 minutes at the same intensity the whole time. And then finally, Jones and her team looked at the role of exercise on future disease flares. In 2,000 individuals with inflammatory bowel disease, they had both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and they found that there was up to a 28% decreased risk of disease flare when people engaged in those higher levels of exercise, which kind of coincides with my own research as well. So again, another academic selfie here. So this is a follow-on from my own research. It's with the same group of individuals. I have removed the healthy controls from this analysis, and we wanted to look at kind of what Jones was looking at, is this idea of the associations between activity, but we're going to look at quality of life rather than disease flare. So we found that moderate to vigorous physical activities were positively associated with physical quality of life. So that means that the more of that activity you do, the higher the level of your quality of life. Likewise, the less of that activity you do, the lower your quality of life. And we found that with MVPA, or moderate to vigorous physical activity, as well as with walking, with physical quality of life. And these relationships were independent of a whole host of different things, including the time spent sitting, resilience, and a whole host of socio-demographic variables, as well as their disease state, so whether in a flare or in remission, and their disease history, so the length of time they had been diagnosed. But really interestingly, we did not find the same relationship with mental quality of life. We actually found that resilience was a much stronger predictor of mental quality of life than physical activity was. So we extended this out to looking at different quartiles. So we broke our physical activity down, our time spent in physical activity down. For moderate to vigorous physical activity, we did this based on the physical activity guidelines that have been set by the US and the CDC and American College of Sports Medicine. So in quartile 1, we have those that engaged in 0 minutes a week, so absolutely no physical activity. We have in quartile 2, those that engage between 1 and 149 minutes, so under that 150-minute a week recommendation by the CDC. Then we have 150 to just under 300, and then 300 and over, which is the, although the 150 minutes a week is seen for health benefits, the 300 minutes a week is going to be those extra benefits that you're going to get from it. And what we found was that those individuals that meet the physical activity guidelines had higher levels of physical health-related quality of life than those that did not meet the physical activity guidelines. But we didn't find the same relationship for moderate to vigorous physical activity and mental health-related quality of life. When we then move over to walking, we also broke these up into quartiles of about an hour a week, or less than an hour a week, 1 to 3 hours, and then so on and so forth, all the way up to more than 420 minutes a week. And what we found was that engaging in more than 1 hour of activity got you benefits of physical health, so you had a higher level of physical health related quality of life. What was really interesting was this quartile here, so 181 to 420 minutes per week. They had significantly higher physical quality of life to those in quartile 1, those in quartile 2, but they also had significantly higher mental health related quality of life. And so this is the first finding that we had to show that physical activity could be in some way associated with that mental component as well. And it does deserve much further research to try and ascertain where that threshold truly is and how we can get by it, and maybe what's driving it as to why that seems to be kind of the perfect zone. There has been some studies looking at this idea of inflammation, so it's not all that we've looked at in terms of quality of life, except that these studies in inflammation have largely been in pediatric populations. So our first study by Legaret and her group found, they did 2 kind of arms of their study, which creates a little bit of confusion. So they did a short-term study, well, they looked at pre and post the first exercise bout, and they did find there was an increase in that short-term inflammatory response. That's pretty normal during exercise. You are causing stress to the human body when we exercise. So we do see a short-term inflammatory response. But what was really interesting is that inflammatory response had gone and was back down to normal and back down to what we see in generally healthy adults and children after 48 hours. Long term in their exercise program, we saw that after 8 weeks of training, their inflammation had decreased over time, which is a really, really great response. And we actually saw no change in disease state, so no worsening of disease state with an 8-week exercise program. In terms of Ploger's research, they again looked at high intensity interval training and moderate intensity continuous training, but they only did a single exercise bout. So that's worth to keep in mind. We don't know what long-term that may have for children, but they saw there was no change in inflammation in terms of short-term response. They did see an anti-inflammatory response. So we saw those markers actually will reduce inflammation had increased when participants had completed the moderate intensity continuous training. And generally, they had the same response as the controls. Most interestingly from these studies, though, is that neither study reported any adverse responses to exercise. And so this is really important as we move forward in understanding that physical activity may actually be that therapeutic strategy that can help people, or at least one in the toolkit for people with inflammatory bowel disease. So where do we go from here? We need to look more into this idea of exercise and inflammation in people with inflammatory bowel disease. There are very few studies right now, and we need to increase this number because it will really help us understand the role that physical activity plays and actually really help us promote the use of physical activity as a therapeutic mode. We also want to understand the different roles that different types of physical activity play. So is yoga going to have the same response to running versus walking to cycling? What about weightlifting? We only have one study that has done any sort of resistance training. And so seeing what future research shows there will be really important. And then how much should we be doing? There are currently no physical activity guidelines for people with inflammatory bowel disease. We have guidelines for people with hypertension, type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes, angina, and many different diseases, but we don't yet have any for inflammatory bowel disease because we don't have enough research. So it's going to be a real push from those of us who are engaging in the research in this area to do this over the next coming years. So after all this, I bet you're thinking, what the heck should I do? I want to be physically active. It sounds good. It sounds like it's going to work for me, but what should I do? What's going to be the best exercise for me? Should I walk? Should I run? Should I bike? Should I lift? So I'm going to pose you back some questions here. So when people ask what that best exercise is, it's such a personal response. Just like everyone eats something different when they have inflammatory bowel disease and you all have different triggers, you're all going to be able to deal with exercise slightly differently. So what do you enjoy? This is one of my favorite questions to ask because really you should do the exercise that you enjoy. Why put yourself through something you don't enjoy? If you didn't enjoy a TV show, you would turn and change the channel. You don't stick through it. The same should be with physical activity and exercise. What do you have access to? It's really difficult right now because we're in a pandemic and many gyms aren't open. So how do we be active when we're in a pandemic? Can you go for a walk around your neighborhood? Is it safe to do that? Is it accessible? Is it pleasant? I am in the Northwest. We are in kind of wildfire season right now, so our air quality is different. And those sorts of things will play a role for you. Are you nearby some water where you can go to a lake and maybe swim or do some water-based activities? Those sorts of things are all things you have to think about. How much time do you have? Maybe you have a family and a job and you have lots of different things going on and you only have 10 minutes in your day to be active. Okay, how are you going to make that work? You may have longer. So what do you do to fill that time? And then this is different to one that I ask anyone else. So if I am training my students or anything like that, I generally want to make sure they're feeling okay. I don't want them to feel rough, but it has a different meaning when you're working with someone with IBD. Is if you don't feel up to it today, you don't have to do it. Okay, you want to be active when it feels good for you. And so if you are active and then you kind of feel crummy the next day, you're sore, or you feel like there are bowel changes, then take it easy and relax. Listen to your body. And that's one of the most important things that you can do. So I've come up with some physical activity guidelines for you. These are not published. They're not even worth publication in terms of they're not kind of that 150 minutes, but they're things I want you to think about. So when we do publish physical activity guidelines, we use what's called the FIT principle: frequency, intensity, time, and type. So frequency, how often should I do it? Intensity, how hard? Time, how long should I do it for? And type, what should I do? So these are my thoughts for you. In terms of frequency, try to do something each week. So if you can do 3 days a week, that really gets quite close to physical activity recommendations. So that's awesome. It's a great way to start. If you've not been active for a few years though, if you can manage 2 days a week, perfect. That's great. Okay, so try and do what your body wants you to do. If you need to take a day off, take that day off and get back to it the next day, whenever you feel that you're more capable to do that. For me, I can't exercise in the heat. And when it's not over 85, 90 degrees, it's no. And that's okay, because I know it's not worth me passing out in the heat exercising. So these are all things that you have to think about as you exercise. Intensity, how hard should you work? You should always start easy. If you've not been active for a while, just go on a walk. Walking is such a powerful exercise. It helps so many mental benefits, and just being out surrounded by nature. If you can get out to a park, that's awesome. Obviously we're in a pandemic right now. If you want to be careful and keep distance with those individuals or wear a mask, that's great. Just start out easy and see how your body feels. You might take your dog for an extra walk. You might try some yoga, those sorts of things. If you feel good, try increasing that intensity a little bit. Walk a little bit faster. If you've done some brisk walking, maybe try jogging, or try riding your bike or going swimming and those sorts of things. And they can help you, but always start low and slow is how we say it, and then increase from up there. In terms of time, how long should you do? Any activity is good. If we can get someone up and moving, that's awesome. If it's a couple of minutes, great. If it's 10 minutes, great. If it's 30, 60, 90 minutes, awesome. It's what you can manage. But really that 10 minutes is a good threshold to aim for. If you can make it, it fits into your day so much easier than saying you've got to do a 60-minute workout. So if you can fit in 10 minutes of maybe just a walk with your dog, or doing some yoga, or just taking a walk around the neighborhood, or go for a little jog, that's awesome. Let's do that 10 minutes, and then we can increase from there, maybe to 15 minutes and then to 20 minutes as you feel good and you feel that you're actually achieving more, you feel that you're becoming more competent at it. And then what should you do? And this is where you might have been expecting me to say, you should really start walking, is going to have the best benefits. You should do whatever you enjoy. I always ask my students at the beginning of one of our physiology classes, what's the best exercise? And I get them to spend about 10 minutes in groups, and they come up with all these wild and wonderful different types of activities. And you hear everything. It's the insanity workout, it's TRX, it's running, it's walking, it's swimming. And very few times do we think outside the box effectively enough. And the answer really should be, it's whatever you enjoy. Because what we want you to do as physical activity professionals is I want you to stick to it. I want you to be active. I want you to get the benefits of being active. So to do that and to adhere to it, you should do what you enjoy. And you should do what you feel good at as well. If you don't enjoy it, you are far less likely to stick to it long term. And that's what we want to achieve. And that's when we truly see the benefits of physical activity. So whatever it is that you enjoy, if you like running, awesome, let's do that. If you like being on a bike, that's perfect. personally, I love being around water. So if you put me out in the water, I can be out there and be active for hours, but I'm not a big runner myself. And so you're going to get me to be far more active and stick to that activity if it's a water-based activity like paddleboarding or kayaking or swimming or anything like that, than if you ask me to go for a run. So find what your enjoyment is and find what you feel good at. Because again, if we feel good at it, we're going to stick to it. I don't feel like I'm good at running. The whole experience, I walk on my tiptoes. It's not a good pitch when we run. So I don't feel like I'm good at it. And I have a lot of social kind of cues about that. I'm like, is someone looking at me and those sorts of things? And so it kind of is off-putting. But when I'm on the water, I feel like I have that. I got that down, and that's me. Okay. If you like team sports or doing stuff in that social aspect of being active, playing tennis with your partner or a family member or a friend, perfect. Let's try that. There are so many ways to be active. And so find what you enjoy and find what you feel good at. And that's going to be your best exercise. So I'm going to wrap up here. I would like to acknowledge those that have helped me over the years with this research that I find to be so meaningful, to be able to really help individuals. So Dr. Chantal Velos was my PhD advisor and now colleague. I owe a lot to her and her patients throughout this whole process. And also my lab colleagues, Megan and Devon. And then I was funded through the Gatorade Sports Science Institute for the data I collected during my dissertation, as well as receiving some travel funding as well. I have included my contact information here if you would like to be able to reach out to me with any questions. If you're unable to make it on Sunday, feel free to, this is my email, it can be accessed at any time through that, and then my Twitter handle as well. And I welcome any and all questions. So as a reminder, we are answering questions. All presenters will be available on Sunday. My slot is between 11 a.m. and noon and will be on Zoom. So feel free to reach out and ask any questions that you have. And it has been great talking to you, and I hope you all have an awesome day. So thank you very much.